In 1945, the United States government made a decision so contradictory to everything they had just fought for that they buried it for half a century. The war had just ended. Nuremberg was underway. American soldiers were still identifying the dead. And somewhere in the ruins of defeated Germany, senior U.S. Army intelligence officers sat across a table from a man who had spent years running Hitler's most sophisticated spy ring in Eastern Europe. His name was Reinhard Gehlen, former Nazi general. And instead of facing judgment at Nuremberg, he was being offered a job. The full details of what happened in that room stayed hidden from the public for over 50 years. When the documents were finally declassified in 2001, historians called what they found, and this is a direct quote from the congressional record, a deeply uncomfortable chapter in American intelligence history. This is that chapter. To understand why the Americans wanted Gehlen, you first need to understand what he had built. By 1944, he ran Fremdheer Ost, Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence division responsible for tracking Soviet forces. His network reached deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, informants, double agents, field operatives embedded where no Western service had any presence at all. He understood Red Army movements, command structures, internal fractures better than almost anyone outside Moscow. He also understood, well before 1945, that Germany was going to lose. So in the final months of the war, Gehlen made a calculated move. He photographed and microfilmed his entire intelligence archive, years of reports, agent identities, Soviet military assessments, and packed them into metal canisters. When the end came, he surrendered not to Soviet forces, but specifically to the Americans. He brought the canisters with him. And he made an offer. I have what you need for the next war. The one that's already beginning. The Americans understood exactly what he meant. The alliance with the Soviet Union was fracturing. The Cold War, not yet named, was already taking shape. And the United States had almost no intelligence infrastructure inside Soviet territory. Their wartime service, the OSS, had been focused on Europe and the Pacific. Against the Soviets, they were operating blind. Gehlen had eyes everywhere the Americans didn't. The man who had served Hitler was now the most valuable intelligence asset Washington possessed. And the question of what he had done in service of that regime, that question got quietly set aside. The formal arrangement between Gehlen and U.S. Army intelligence took shape across 1945 and 1946, built on one central principle: Gehlen's network would be preserved, funded, and given operational freedom in exchange for directing its resources against Soviet targets on America's behalf. The program was called Operation Rusty, later renamed the Gehlen Organization. For more than a decade, it operated as a shadow intelligence service, staffed largely by former Wehrmacht and SS personnel, funded through American military channels, and given a degree of autonomy its handlers frequently struggled to control. This is where the record becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Declassified documents confirm the Gehlen organization employed individuals with direct connections to wartime atrocities. Among them, former members of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile units responsible for systematic mass operations across Eastern Europe. These weren't peripheral hires. Some held active operational roles within the network while simultaneously being sought by war crimes investigators. The Americans knew. Or more precisely, the evidence strongly suggests they were told, and continued the arrangement regardless. A CIA internal review, partially declassified and cited in the 1999 U.S. congressional investigation into Nazi war crimes and U.S. government records, acknowledged that concerns about problematic personnel had been documented as early as 1948. The review noted they were, again, a direct quote, documented and set aside in the interest of operational continuity. Set aside. By 1956, the Gehlen organization was handed to the newly formed West German government and reconstituted as the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, Germany's primary foreign intelligence service to this day. Reinhard Gehlen served as its first director until 1968. When the National Archives released approximately 1.2 million pages under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998, researchers expected difficult findings. What they encountered was, in some ways, stranger than anticipated, not because of dramatic new revelations, but because of how ordinary everything looked on the page. No anguished memos. No internal debates about moral compromise. Documents describing the integration of former Nazi personnel into American-funded operations read, in many cases, like routine administrative correspondence. Names. Ranks. Operational assignments. Budget lines. The bureaucratic language of institutions that had simply moved on. Historian Timothy Naftali, who contributed to the 1999 congressional report, described the overall picture as one of institutional indifference to past crimes when present utility was considered sufficient justification. The Gehlen case, he concluded, was not an exception within early CIA operations. It was closer to standard practice in the specific context of Soviet intelligence collection. What remains disputed, genuinely contested among historians, is how far up the chain explicit knowledge traveled. A 2001 CIA internal history of the Gehlen relationship, authored by Kevin Ruffner and partially declassified, acknowledged serious lapses in personnel vetting. It stopped short of concluding that senior leadership had explicitly authorized the employment of individuals with documented war crimes exposure. That distinction matters. And the surviving record does not resolve it. What the files do confirm, without dispute, for more than a decade, the United States funded and operationally relied on an intelligence network staffed by individuals whose wartime records were known to be deeply problematic. And this was considered, at the time, an acceptable cost. The files were classified for 50 years. They weren't sealed because the information was dangerous to national security in any ongoing sense. They were sealed because someone, somewhere, decided the public didn't need to know what had been traded away, and for what. We tend to think of moral compromises as rare moments, decisions made under impossible pressure, by people who had no other options. The Gehlen files suggest something more unsettling. That the compromises weren't agonized over. They were administered. Processed, filed under operational continuity and left for someone else's generation to find. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the people making these decisions in 1946 had known these documents would eventually be read by the public, would they have chosen differently? Or would they simply have written more careful memos? If this story left you with something to say, a question, a disagreement, a name that belongs in this conversation, the comments are there for it. That's where the real discussion usually happens. And if you think this kind of history deserves more attention than it gets, subscribing is how you make sure we can keep going.